Ladies and gentlemen, friends, good afternoon. It's a great pleasure for me to be here, and the pleasure is even all the more distinct because I was here 5 years ago when I had the occasion to speak on a very different subject on Gandhi and religion. But before I commence my talk today, I would like to extend my heartfelt gratitude to the College of the Humanities at Carleton University and the Mahatma Gandhi Peace Council of Ottawa for once again inviting me to deliver the annual Mahatma Gandhi Lecture. Now, we all know why we're gathered here, but you know, in the circles that I move around in, and among some Gandhi scholars, the occasion of Gandhi's Shahidat, his martyrdom, January 30th, is the most important day in the Gandhi calendar. Because Gandhi not only knew the art of living, he also knew the art of dying, which of course is a subject for another lecture, but I would like to call to your mind, just so that one can begin to think in a different vein, that shortly after the assassination of Martin Luther King, there appeared in the Chicago Sun-Times an extraordinary cartoon by a cartoonist by the name of Muldoon. And in this cartoon you see Gandhi sitting down and King is standing next to him. And Gandhi says to King, well, don't you know, Martin, that people like you and me have to be assassinated again and again, right? So I think that if you think about that, then we understand what are the extraordinary burdens that come with being a Mahatma or being someone like Martin Luther King, and how is it that societies in fact receive their teachings. Now, one of the most extraordinary things about Gandhi from my point of view is that no matter what domain of life one thinks about, he represents an extraordinary anomaly. He represents an anomaly because, for example, I think it can be argued, and a number of Gandhi scholars have argued, and I think this was actually well known in his own time, that everyone else who had adopted ahimsa, non-violence, did so as a matter of policy. But Gandhi did so as a matter of creed. Which is why you always used to say that if you are a minority of one that believes in the truth is still the truth. Right? If you take, for example, the entire project of independence, well, what was the ultimate logic of that? The ultimate logic of it was that we were going to achieve a nation state. And yet, the indisputable, unimpeachable fact is that Mohandas Gandhi was deeply suspicious of that entity called the nation state. Right? Deeply suspicious of the state for all kinds of reasons. So I think that when we begin to think of Gandhi, we have to wrestle with this fact that he represents, as I've said, in all domains of life, a rather anomalous way of thinking. Of course, an absolutely distinct way of thinking. And I suggest this as a prelude because when we try to take the measure of this man and say that, well, we don't want to really go in the vein of either excessive praise or excessive blame, then one begins to try to understand some of the quandaries that come about when we start reflecting on his life. Especially when viewed against the kind of trajectory of thought that his contemporaries had subscribed to all over the world. Right? And in this particular paper, what I should seek to do is to explore one set of anomalies around the question of rights. Nothing has struck me as more anomalous than the fact that Mohandas Gandhi, who fought for the right of Indians to self-determination and can be viewed as one of the major initiators of some of the principal movements of the 20th century, including anti-colonialism and the struggle against racism, seldom spoke about rights, and almost never about human rights. It would not be too much to say that the language of rights was alien to Gandhi. And in this paper, I shall attempt to unravel the nuances and implications of this worldview. It would likewise be difficult to overstate the gravity of this claim if one only pauses to consider that human rights talk has now become utterly normalized and is part of what might be called a global common sense. If McDonald's, Japanese anime, Michael Jackson, and Michael Jordan are modes by means of which communication is carried out across cultures, so is human rights talk. There isn't a community in the world, howsoever defined, that has not embraced the language of rights and that does not seek rights for itself. It is a testament to the domestication of human rights talk that even those who are in constant breach of the observance of human rights pay their fealty to the idea. Autocratic rulers and dictators fully understand that there are international protocols which govern the monitoring of human rights, and consequently violations of human rights are generally outright denied, classified as inadvertent collateral damage, camouflaged as triggered by terrorist attacks from internal or external enemies, or even attributed to the enemy itself. It is a sign of our times, if I may be somewhat ironical here, that diversity training and training in sensitivity to human rights are now of necessity required of every dictator and autocrat. I am, of course, far from having demonstrated that human rights talk was foreign to Gandhi, and I shall do so shortly. The critic might at this juncture step in and ask whether such rights talk was not in fact unusual in most of Gandhi's lifetime, and if that should be the case, why we should think that Gandhi was singularly alone in disavowing the language of rights. Let me, before venturing forth into what will perforce be a very brief account of the evolution of the idea of human rights, point to the distinctiveness of Gandhi's thinking on this subject. Just months before his assassination on 30th January 1948, Gandhi was among some 150 of the most eminent persons of the day invited by Julian Huxley, a famous evolutionary biologist and then Director General of the newly created UNESCO, to furnish written comments for a collection of philosophical reflections on human rights that might furnish as a universal declaration. The word of man, the invitation to him stated, is at a critical stage in its political, social, and economic conditions. If it is to proceed further on the path toward unity, it must develop a common set of ideas and principles. One of these is a common formulation of the rights of man, end quote. Now, most of the respondents, while endorsing the idea of a common formulation of the rights of man, expressed the desirability of proceeding with caution. Some worried whether it would be the insights of Western philosophers which would in the last analysis shape the document, or whether the diverse experiences of humankind would be accommodated to arrive at some conception of human rights that would do justice to all. The Catholic theologian and philosopher Jacques Maritain gave it as his view that any such document could only reflect the human condition at any given time and could therefore not be viewed as final. The eminent Italian philosopher Benedetto Croce expressed more reservations than most, but the respondents endorsed the enterprise while urging Huxley and his colleagues at UNESCO to shun ethnocentrism and embrace pluralism. Gandhi alone demurred from the enterprise with this note, and this is what he sends to Huxley. Quote, "I learned from my illiterate but wise mother that all rights to be deserved and preserved came from duty well done. Thus the very right to live accrues to us only when we do the duty of citizenship to the world." From this one foundational statement, perhaps it is easy enough to define the duties of man and woman and correlate every right to some corresponding duty to be first performed, end quote. As I shall suggest later, this was a view that Gandhi had held over the course of the last 40 years. Rights discourse came into its own at the end of World War II and was precipitated by a constellation of circumstances, among them the calamitous loss of life on a scale never before witnessed in history, crimes against humanity, and crimes of aggression that were perhaps similarly unprecedented in scope, the revolt against racism, and the rise of anti-colonial movements that sought to dignify and give teeth to the principle of equality for all without respect to race, color, religion, or gender. neither the circumstances of the war, nor the nearly universal approbation for the conception of human rights, embodied less than a year after Gandhi's death in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, appear to have done much to alter his thinking on the question of rights, or to put it more precisely, made him a thoroughgoing advocate as a modern liberal view demands of human rights. In attempting to locate Gandhi's position, it may be useful to take a bird's eye view of the evolution of human rights to its present exalted state in Western civilization. And when I say present exalted state, I mean only in principle. I wouldn't even remotely suggest that the nation states of the West are all deeply committed to the actual practice of what we might call human rights. Most religions have generally prescribed duties, not rights. And Judaism and Christianity were not exceptional in this regard. Histories of the subject ordinarily begin somewhere in the mid-17th century, often taking as their starting point John Locke's defense of property rights and the view developed by a number of moral philosophers that rights emanated from natural law. Though the ideas of Locke, and here I tread on exceedingly familiar terrain, would become critically important to the American colonists a century later in their quest for liberation from the oppression of the British monarch, modern day commentators have largely forgotten that Locke viewed revolution not only as a right, but as a duty. Indeed, what is common to European moral and political philosophers until well into the 18th century is their insistence on the importance of duties rather than rights. Locke's counterpart on the continent, the German political philosopher, jurist, and historian Samuel Pufendorf, would in 1673 even pen a treatise called On the Duty of Man and Citizen. To the extent that Locke, Pufendorf, Hugo Grotius, and other thinkers, many of whom have now become the point of origination for understanding the evolution of rights discourse, spoke of rights, they did so only to articulate the view that rights offered escape from the confining world of duties. Some of you might recall that little ditty from the minor American transcendentalist poet Ellen Sturgis Hooper, quote, "I slept and dreamed that life was beauty. I woke and found that life was duty." Now, this understanding carried through to the period of revolution, though here again the tendency in modern times has been to obfuscate rather than merely celebrate the history of that pivotal document called Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, 1789, the first article of which reads as follows: "Men are born and remain free and equal in rights. Social distinctions can only be founded on the common good." Now, only a few years into the revolution following the death of Robespierre, the Declaration was rewritten, and its new title delineates precisely the contours of the changes. And the new title now is Declaration of the Rights and Duties of Man and Citizen, 1795. Its drafters noted in the first article under duties that the Declaration of Rights contains the obligations of the legislators. The maintenance of society requires that those who compose it should both know and fulfill their duties. It was well and good to fire a people and forge a revolution on the basis of rights, but in the performance of duties lay the foundation of any society. Now, it is not within the province of my paper to enter into a detailed discussion of the Declaration of Rights of Man and of the Citizen. The most obvious criticism, and a wholly legitimate one, that in fact dates to the period of its formulation, is the fact that this grandiose declaration excluded women from its purview. The Haitian Revolution early in the 19th century exposed the other critical limitations of this document, as Ralph Michel Trujillo's moving exposition of the Haitian Revolution as the unthinkable has so brilliantly demonstrated. So what he demonstrates and argues there is that even the greatest Enlightenment thinkers simply could not fathom the idea of the Haitian Revolution. They thought it inconceivable that a black man or a black woman should aspire to something called freedom. Right? What is, however, germane to my argument is that the blind spot in the history of the redrafting of the Declaration has everything to do with the modern view that the shift of gravity from duties to rights is analogous to the movement away from religion and towards secularism. While the revolutions of the late 18th century were pivotal in giving rise to this reading, the largely secular thinkers of the early 19th century were still speaking predominantly in the language of duties rather than rights. The freedom of the individual was only possible owing to the performance by others of their duty to safeguard the rights of others. To put it plainly, duties and rights were inextricably intertwined. What undergirds rights was some notion of collective responsibility. The two together constituted the framework for a democratic society. The increasing pull of secularism, the apotheosis of the idea of the individual, the birth of the human subject, the revolution of 1848, Marx and Engels' call to the workers of the world to unite, all these contributed to the gradual erosion of duties in the political languages circulating in the 1840s and 1850s. It is a telling sign of how far the pendulum had swung that the Italian revolutionary politician, activist for the unification of Italy, and founder of a society that came to be known as Young Italy, Mazzini, had to make a case for duties. Now, he proceeded to do so in a book called The Duties of Man, 1860. This book came to the attention of Gandhi. At least some years before that seminal tract of 1909, Hind Swaraj, which is increasingly being viewed as a foundational statement of the Gandhian worldview. Gandhi was a year shy of launching Satyagrah when, on 22 July 1905, he penned a brief, if agitatory, biographical note on Mazzini for his journal, Indian Opinion. There are very few instances in the world where a single man has brought about the uplift of his country, wrote Gandhi, by his strength of mind and by his extreme devotion during his own lifetime. Such was the unique Mazzini, end quote. Hind Swaraj shows a still deeper engagement with the history of Italy in the 19th century, at the center of which stood the figures of Mazzini and Garibaldi. Just months before he wrote Hind Swaraj, Gandhi had been reading Mazzini while serving out a sentence in Pretoria prison. Gandhi even devoted a chapter to Italy and India in Hind Swaraj, which would be odd to those who are not fully cognizant of the place that the struggle for the unification of Italy had acquired in Indian political thinking. Even one of Gandhi's most determined ideological opponents, Vinay Lal, was caught up in the moral and political fervor with which Indian nationalists viewed the struggle to seek the unification of Italy in the teeth of Austrian opposition. Savarkar went so far as to translate Mazzini into Marathi. He also authored a biography of him. But what Gandhi extracted from Mazzini was doubtless something rather different. Quote, Mazzini has shown in his writings on the duty of man that every man must learn how to rule himself. Now I'd like to just pause there for a second to extrapolate that, to repeat that. Mazzini has shown in his writings on the duty of man that every man must learn how to rule himself. Because if you think about Hind Swaraj, that foundational statement, right? So that the subtitle of that work is Hind Swaraj, or Indian Home Rule, and most people have read it as an argument for self-determination, right? But that was never the principal argument of Hind Swaraj. And it was never the principal argument because what Gandhi was attempting to argue there, and this is what he got from Mazzini, is that Hind Swaraj, self-rule, is not just rule in nation-state terms or independence or political autonomy, that before one can make a case for that, one must be able to rule over oneself. One must be able to contain and control and domesticate one's baser instincts. And that is why there are extensive chapters in this little tract which Gopal Krishna Gokhale, who Gandhi also considered his mentor, when he showed Gokhale Hind Swaraj, Gokhale said, "This is a rather embarrassing work. I think you should just consign it to the dustbin." But this was the foundational statement, because Gandhi's argument would be that there is a relationship between our demand for self-determination, and we can only make that demand when we in fact take a control over ourselves. Mazzini, but not Garibaldi, appears in the appendix at the Hind Swaraj among the authorities, as Gandhi calls them, that Gandhi recommended to the reader for his or her perusal. Given then the importance of Mazzini to Gandhi's thinking, it behooves us to take a slightly closer look at the duties of man. There was no happiness industry those days, as there is now, but even in 1860, Mazzini felt moved to argue that the theory of happiness, as he says, having been construed as the primary aim of existence, was calculated only to produce egoistic men. The order of the day was to find a principle which shall guide men toward their own improvement, teach them constancy and self-sacrifice, and unite them with their fellow men. And this principle is duty, end quote. When Gandhi was to write in Hind Swaraj that real rights are a result of performance of duty, he was but echoing Mazzini. I quote, "I merely say that such rights can only exist as a consequence of duties fulfilled, and that we must begin with the latter in order to achieve the former," end quote. Yet there is something more far-reaching in what Gandhi was able to take away from his reading of Mazzini. Liberty itself was the outcome of duties rather than, as we commonly imagine, rights. It is in such a conception of liberty that mankind could move in concert toward the end of common perfectibility. Now I have a section here which I'm going to omit, which is on Gandhi's relationship to the law, which is again an extraordinarily complicated issue, because of course Gandhi was trained as a lawyer, but if you read Hind Swaraj, you know that he has an absolutely withering critique of the legal profession. He has a legal critique of a withering critique of the legal profession, as he does of railways, for example, because Gandhi had a conception of what I call the third party, namely that the lawyer is this third party, which, and just like the British are the third party, because what was one of the fundamental arguments that the British posited for their presence in India, namely that we are here to keep the peace between the Hindus and the Muslims. Right? They are the third party. So the lawyer is a third party between the two adversaries. And of course Gandhi had a fundamental critique of the whole adversarial nature of modern law. Right? So it is important, in order to understand the Gandhi's conception of rights and duties, but it's a very long detour, which I shall have to omit, although I'll be happy to entertain questions about that later on. Now, this relationship to the law, which I have discussed in the paper and which I've given you a mere hint of, furnishes the first clues we require in order to unravel Gandhi's conception of the rights and duties that are dependent upon the idea of citizenship. As is the case with rights, Gandhi did not often speak of citizenship. But that is not surprising, considering that the discourse of citizenship is comparatively recent to our times. Some political philosophers might argue, well, it goes back to, for example, Plato, the idea of citizenship, because what was the polis? The polis was, a small unit. But, if you read the Republic, for example, you know very well that Plato doesn't really have a conception of citizenship, and we know that there are entire classes of people, the helots, the slaves, who are excluded from the polis, right? So I think that it is, in fact, actually what I would call the discourse of citizenship is, in fact, a recent discourse, comparatively speaking. The idea of the rights of the citizen, as we have seen, received their most extended, albeit still incomplete, expression in the French Revolution. But in a colonial state, there are few, if any, citizens. Following the Indian Rebellion of 1857-58, the British and Indians alike became subjects of Victoria, though as subjects they had vastly different rights. As subjects of Victoria and of her successors, the British in India could claim certain rights as citizens within the empire. Indians, on the other hand, had only the right to petition the Queen, though the vast majority of them would not have known how to exercise this right to seek more rights. One of the peculiarities of the discourse of citizenship is that the conception of the citizen has gone hand in hand with the conception of rights. A citizen of, let's say, Ottawa, or Delhi, or Rome, whatever the case may be described as an inhabitant of that city, but the word citizen carries with it a charge that can only be conveyed by some other sentiment. Thus, if one were asked to furnish a definition of the word citizen, it is likely that one might think of the citizen as a bearer of certain entitlements, in particular the right to franchise. The Oxford English Dictionary, the most authoritative source for the English language, is explicit in providing this link. A citizen, it says, and I quote the dictionary here, is an inhabitant of a city or often of a town, especially one possessing civic rights and privileges. Right? So this definition of the citizen provided by the Oxford English Dictionary says nothing about what you would call duties. Correspondingly, it defines a citizen of the world as someone who is at home and claims his rights everywhere, a cosmopolitan. Right? Now, to be sure, Gandhi commenced his own political life with the conception of the citizen as a bearer of rights and privileges. When he was thrown off the train at Petermaritzburg for daring as a coolie to enter a first-class cabin, it dawned on him that as an Indian he had no rights in South Africa. Right? He came to the realization that you could be an attorney, as he was, but that every Indian in South Africa was but a coolie. But evidently, judging from what transpired at that moment and how he chose to shape his life thereafter, it also dawned on him that he had a duty to resist injustice. Now, it would appear to be a self-evident proposition that for the rest of his life, Gandhi would remain deeply committed to a political struggle designed to secure equal rights for all Indians, first within the empire and then as free subjects of an independent India. But as I have thus far suggested, and shall now elaborate in greater detail, Gandhi is distinct among the political and moral thinkers of our time in decisively rejecting the exclusive association of citizenship with the demand for rights. In the first instance, he resuscitated that hidden third term, namely duty, so rights, citizenship, duty, to flesh out the meaning of both rights and citizenship. And secondly, he sought to restore the idea of the commons within which the true citizen finds the true fulfillment of his or her life. The bulk of my remaining comments shall be focused on Gandhi's conception of duty and how he brought it into play with the idea of rights. However, considering the mark that he has left as an ecological thinker, it is apposite that I should also briefly turn in my concluding remarks to Gandhi as someone who anticipated the Anthropocene age in dwelling insistently on our moral obligation to fulfill our duties. Though the notion of duties and rights might seem to bear a symbiotic relationship to each other, it is an indubitable fact, as I have argued thus far, that the two have seldom been brought into conversation with each other, and seldom have they been the subjects of conjoined political inquiry. If one looks, for example, at the question of rights and duties in relation to the sexes, it is transparently clear that women were almost never seen as the bearers of rights and privileges. I trace briefly the long arc in the evolution of human rights leading to the revolutions of the late 18th century that would render the discourse of rights into a widely shared discourse of civil society. Thereafter, over a long period of time, as anti-colonial struggles developed around the world and the masses and the working classes in the industrialized nations experienced a political awakening, the notion of rights began to hold sway over the imagination of common people. We are, at this present juncture, once again where Mazzini positioned himself in 1860 when he felt called upon to reflect upon the duties of man. The language of duty, I would say it's no exaggeration to say this, has almost entirely disappeared from our political vocabulary. You know, I've taught at the University of California, Los Angeles for 26 years, and the student body there is as diverse as you can possibly get. 45% of it is Asian American, right? And not once in 26 years have I had a student who has come and told me, you know, I understand what my rights are, these are my duties. Everyone is clamoring to be recognized. Everyone is clamoring to be recognized as an Indian American, Chinese American, Hispanic American, Black American, gay, whatever the case may be, right? Indeed, in a world where identity politics thrives on its insistence of rights for distinct political, ethnic, racial, linguistic, or religious groups, the very notion of duties has been rendered obsolete. At the commencement of his political career, as Gandhi strove to secure rights to Indians, he also undertook to inquire into the duties that might correspond with the rights that were being claimed by those who were the victims of injustice. During the first year, he wrote in Satyagrah in South Africa, "I was merely the witness and the victim of these wrongs. I then awoke to a sense of my duty." Many of his actions are inexplicable, even inexcusable according to his critics. If one fails to comprehend that Gandhi found it unethical to hold to a conception of rights without demanding adherence to a conception of duties. The most unforgiving of these critics are outraged, to take one illustration, that at the outbreak of the Boer War, Gandhi decided to render aid to the British in South Africa by raising an ambulance corps. Gandhi has described the lively discussion that took place among the Indians about the course of action they should follow when the war broke out between the British and the minority Boers. When I say South Africa, there was no Union of South Africa. Of course, that only came about partially as a consequence of this war in 1905. Right? That the Indians were required to adopt some position was not in doubt. One of the charges laid against them, Gandhi says in Satyagrah in South Africa, is that, quote, they were merely a dead weight upon the British, unable to protect themselves and their own homes, and wholly incapable of assisting the British in the event of an attack. Now, some in the community, mindful of the fact that the British and the Boers were equally oppressors to Indians, counseled neutrality. Gandhi and some friends, on the other hand, embraced the view that Indians were duty-bound to assist the British. As Gandhi has reported, he argued that, quote, our existence in South Africa is only in our capacity as British subjects. In every memorial we have presented our rights as such. And quote, while conceding that justice most likely lay on the side of the Boers, Gandhi nevertheless advocated support of the British cause. The authorities may not always be right, he told his audience, but so long as the subjects own allegiance to a state, it is their clear duty generally to accommodate themselves and to accord their support to acts of the state. End quote. Let me put it this way. Gandhi saw rights and duties as occupying an appositional rather than oppositional relationship. If he held to the position that rights flow from duties, he was not blind to the obvious circumstance that historically deprived groups have been compelled to perform duties without having any rights conferred on them. The burden of exercising duties must fall heavily, Gandhi held, on those who occupy the most privileged positions in society, and accordingly Gandhi could admit the possibility that those who have been deprived of rights should have fewer duties devolve upon them. If Indians were to advance claims against the British, Gandhi recognized, for example, that lower castes were similarly entitled to claim entitlements against the upper castes. He wrote in 1934 that Harijans, which of course is a term around which there's been a huge amount of discussion, should be taught to assert their rights of elementary citizenship. This is 1934. Nevertheless, it is perhaps not much of a stretch to suggest that he eventually came to view duties as holding nearly the same relationship to rights as means do to ends. Gandhi had always been attentive to the means. If the means were compromised, the end attained would be questionable. That Gandhi was not indifferent to the ends is obvious from the fact that in 1942, when World War II had derailed Indian independence, Gandhi issued something of an ultimatum to the British and advised his countrymen and women, and that's the mantra, do or die. Indians were entitled to their freedom, and Gandhi appeared to be saying were to be prepared to secure this right at any price. But his more characteristic position is gleaned from the appeal he addressed to the people of the native state of Rajkot, who were immersed in a struggle with the local ruler on 13th March 1939. Quote, in Swaraj based on ahimsa, people need not know their rights, but it is necessary for them to know their duties. But this is extraordinary. In Swaraj, right? So the same word as in the book Hind Swaraj, Swar, self, Raj, rule. In Swaraj, based on ahimsa, non-violence, people need not know their rights, but it is necessary for them to know their duties. There is no duty but creates a corresponding right, and those are true rights which flow from a due performance of one's duties. True Swaraj, he continues, comes only from the performance by individuals of their duty as citizens. In it, no one thinks of his rights. End quote. I adverted previously to his declination of Julian Huxley's invitation to him to submit some thoughts on the desirability of a universal charter for human rights, but that this was in no wise inconsistent with the general tenor of his thinking becomes palpably clear in his response to a similar request from H.G. Wells during the war. Now, one of the world's most prominent writers, and as president of PEN International, Wells, who was, by the way, a historian who wrote a book called Outline of World History, which sold 2 million copies. I teach in a history department. If historians sell 200 copies, they get delighted. He sold 2 million copies, right? So Wells, a pacifist who had been one of Gandhi's most staunch supporters in stodgy Britain, drafted a Declaration of Rights, wrote a series of articles in British newspapers on the desirability of producing a specific declaration of the broad principles on which our public and social life is based, and in early 1940 published a book called The Rights of Man, or What Are We Fighting For? It might then have come as a surprise to him when, having sought Gandhi's endorsement, he received in reply this admonition, and I quote this at some length. Received your cable, have carefully read your 5 articles. You will permit me to say you are on the wrong track. I feel sure that I can draw up a better charter of rights than you have drawn up, but what good will it be? Who will become its guardian? If you mean propaganda or popular education, you have begun at the wrong end. I suggest the right way. Begin with a charter of duties of man, and I promise the rights will follow as spring follows winter. I write from experience. As a young man, I began life by seeking to assert my rights, and I soon discovered I had none, not even over my wife. So I began by discovering and performing my duty by my wife, my children, friends, companions, and society, and I find today that I have greater rights, perhaps, than any living man I know. If this is too tall a claim, then I say I do not know anyone who possesses greater rights than I. End quote. In true Swaraj, no one thinks of rights. See, the radical nature of his thinking requires that we have to really place him outside all the cliches that you have ever entertained about Gandhi. That is my submission. I just very recently, on October 2nd, published a very long piece called Gandhi, a Player of Infinite Games. dissenters, even the most radical dissenters, play within boundaries. Gandhi played with boundaries. The very proposition in Swaraj, true Swaraj, no one thinks of rights, this very proposition leaves us breathless. In the world we inhabit today, it would render Gandhi into a pariah. We might suppose that there is at least an unquestionable right to life. But here too, Gandhi surprises us, gives us a different kind of reading. Do we have a right to our life if we do not stand by our duty of preserving the lives of others? Now, if this seems to turn Gandhi into an advocate of capital punishment, which of course he was not, this position cannot be sustained. I may not have a right to my own life, but the other person's duty to preserve my life ought to guarantee my life. Every right, Gandhi was certain, correlates to some corresponding duty to be first performed. We thus arrive yet again at this anomaly. Though Gandhi became the chief spokesperson for the rights of Indians and of the rights of the oppressed all over the world, he also embraced the view that attentiveness by individuals to the performance of their duties is the true condition of their liberation. Liberation not only from colonial rule or oppression from outside, but from one's ego, desires, and habits of thought. If, as is now evident, Gandhi sought to alter the terms of political discourse by calling attention to duties as much as rights, this logically calls to mind the next question. Just how do we determine what constitutes one's duties and what is the realm of action that one must undertake? Many scholars of Gandhi have supposed that the answer to this is relatively easy and that Gandhi himself has furnished all the necessary cues. For example, they have said that, well, we should think about Gandhi's attachment to the Bhagavad Gita, and there is no question, of course, that the Gita exercised an incalculable influence over Gandhi's life, and that he studied the text very closely. But my submission to you would be that ultimately, Gandhi did not stand by texts. And that is why, even though he venerated the Ramcharitmanas, Tulsidas' Ramcharitmanas, he was very clear in his mind that if there are passages in that book which are objectionable, and there are, he said, you must dismiss those passages. If the text does not meet the litmus test of your conscience, then dismiss the text, right? Actually, the question of how we determine duties and so on is outside the realm of this paper, because we would have to enter into a different set of questions altogether. And of course, we would also have to take recourse to the fundamental Indian categories, which is dharma, right? And everyone has a dharma. Even a dog has its dharma. Every individual has its dharma, but the dharma of a dog is to bark. The dharma of a snake is to hiss. So we have, as an individual, our dharma is to ourselves, to the family, to the community, to the nation. Now this brings me then to my final set of considerations, revolving around whether Gandhi's conception of the commons, which is incipient in all his writings and pervasive in his conduct, does not also lead us both to a yet more expansive conception of duties and to a still more critical position on the question of rights in the Anthropocene age. So the Anthropocene age is this age, as some scholars have argued, because this is the first time in human history where the activities of man are fundamentally altering more than just human relations. They are altering the very nature of our being and, of course, inducing these kinds of extreme weather events and so on, right? Before doing so, however, it is important for me to acknowledge the fact, and I simply acknowledge it here because, again, it's really in a way outside the purview of this paper, but it's important to mention it. Acknowledge the fact that the idea of human rights has seen massive expansion over the course of the last several decades. And also to suggest that such a development, as I've said, has no fundamental bearing on my argument. And so when I speak of the expansion, what I'm speaking about, the fact is that in the late 19th century, it was still conventional to distinguish between civil and political rights, right? We don't always understand that, but for example, the right to be treated equally under the law, the right to receive due process was a civil right. The right to vote, the right to hold office was a political right. These two were collapsed in the 20th century to become political rights. And then, of course, after the passage of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, this expansion took place because, of course, people started thinking about women's rights, indigenous people's rights, economic rights, the right to housing, and so on. Right? So that's what I mean by the expansion. And even within the domain of the political, if you look at, for example, the 19th century concept of political rights, you see an enormous expansion in our day in this conception of political rights. An illustration of that, of course, would be something like, for example, what is called the responsibility to protect doctrine, right? Which has now become a part of international humanitarian and law as well. Although there are legitimate grounds to dispute whether this doctrine confers a duty on states to intervene when the actions of another state place the lives and livelihoods of its subjects in extreme jeopardy, or whether, as many have forcefully argued, the doctrine has been appropriated by powerful states to confer upon themselves the right to intervene in the affairs of weaker states. If, for example, human rights activists took the view that, well, what you have is you have a genocide going on in the United States in slow process against African Americans. Let's supposing someone were to make that argument. Well, India and Sudan and the Congo and Indonesia and Bangladesh wouldn't be able to wheel together a force and say, well, we have the responsibility to protect these people. It simply wouldn't, it's inconceivable that that would happen. So obviously the responsibility to protect doctrine, some have argued, has become in fact another tool of imperialism. I'm not stating a position on this, I'm suggesting to you that there are complications in how one looks at the whole question of responsibility to protect. And in that context, let me remind you once again of that small line in Gandhi's reply to H.G. Wells when he was asked for his endorsement of this Charter of Human Rights. And what did he say? Who will be its guardian? Who will be its guardian, right? So I think that rejoinder is as pertinent now as it was then. Living as we are in the Anthropocene age, it appears to me that we now have to take this discussion to a loftier and yet more critical plane. Now, I don't have the luxury of offering even a minimal sketch of the moral, political, and intellectual contours of the idea of the commons. Hitherto, the notion of the commons has been most commonly understood in its ecological sense, pointing to an enhanced awareness that biodiversity and humanity's inheritance of natural resources are at great peril. From the Club of Rome report down to the ecological movements in opposition to big dams, strip mining, unregulated disposal of hazardous wastes, the wanton destruction of animal and plant species. You may have read the recent report that 2.7 billion fewer birds now than there were just a decade or two ago, right? The uprooting of forests and the like. There have been numerous attempts, when we think of all of that, to restore the notion of commons. In recent years, moreover, the much acclaimed World Social Forum can be viewed as an attempt to expand considerably the reach of this idea. Opposition to intellectual property rights, drug patenting, corporate mergers, the appropriation of land in the name of development, the privatization of water, and many other such phenomena is also inspired by the desire to reclaim the commons. In India, the idea of the commons has been even more seriously compromised than what is suggested by such phenomena as the immense gulf between the country's billionaires and its hundreds of billions who still live below the poverty line, the widespread inaccessibility to safe drinking water, and the shocking lack of basic amenities without which a life of dignity seems rather inconceivable. It is one of the more deplorable characteristics of what has passed for development that the country's elites have opted out of the state, abandoned the commons, and are committed only to what I would call a rights-based conception of citizenship. In suggesting that they have opted out of the state, I mean a great many things, from their rejection of the public sector, state-run schools, and the idea of social services to their feverish embrace of privatization, their unabashed celebration of greed, and the so-called principles of the free market, their open enthusiasm for special economic zones, and their brazen defense of gross inequality. It should surprise you not in the least that Gandhi had much to say on all these matters. If one takes, for example, the subject of education, it is rather remarkable that already by the mid-1930s, when the educated comprised a relatively tiny community, Gandhi was beginning to have grave suspicions about the value and utility of formal education, particularly university-level education. In 1936, he was visited by an American clergyman, Reverend Mott. And Reverend Mott and Gandhi had this extraordinary dialogue which extends over some days. Towards the end of Reverend Mott's visit, he asked Gandhi, he says, "Gandhiji, tell me, what is it that gives you the greatest hope in our times?" This is 1936. And Gandhi says, "Despite all the provocations, the people of this country still stand by ahimsa." And then Reverend Mott says, "What fills you with the greatest despair?" And Gandhi says, "The hard-heartedness of the educated." Those are his exact words. The hard-heartedness of the educated. It is his unique way of inhabiting the ecological commons and his exemplary sensitivity to the duty that we owe to nature, which is the very ground of our being, that alone is germane to my argument in these concluding moments. I shall therefore close my considerations. I'll close my comments with some considerations that are central to my argument here. The dominant post-World War II ideology to which everyone has been required to assent, on the pain of being condemned as backward, anti-modern, and out of step with the charmed narrative of progress, can be characterized in one word: development. Gandhi was not greatly enthused by the idea. And development is not the same as social change. There is no society that is stagnant. But development is an ideology. Indeed, long before it became de rigueur in some circles to critique development, he had already recognized that the notion of growth is the ultimate intoxicant of modern society. It will put all our economists out of work if you critique this mantra of growth. The mantra of growth spares no one. Its one non-negotiable principle is the idea that there is always room for growth. Not merely that the poor must develop and run the race, or in the bland language of the well-intentioned, reach their full human potential, but also that the rich can become yet richer. Such an ideology, you may have surmised, thrives on the language of rights and makes no demands of anyone except that they should forcefully exert their right to consumption, choice, and so on. Now, Gandhi was among those who recognized that in this form the idea of growth, which is entirely shorn of the idea of responsibility, is supremely antithetical to the quality of human life. More alarmingly, if it were carried to its extreme logic, such an idea portended the ransacking of the earth's resources and selective genocide. I quote from what he says to an interlocutor in 1928. "God forbid that India should ever take to industrialism after the manner of the West. The economic imperialism of a single tiny island kingdom, England, is today keeping the world in chains. If an entire nation of 300 millions took to similar economic exploitation, it would strip the world bare like locusts. End quote. What if Gandhi seems to be asking? Nature was the bearer of rights. What would nature have to say on this subject? Are what these days what are known as extreme weather events nature's revenge on us? A reminder to humankind that the balance has swung so far in the direction of rights that the scale will now have to be tipped in the direction of duties. So this is where my reading is very different than the people who work on the Anthropocene age, because they don't put this within the context of what I'm calling the language of rights and duties. When I earlier entertained some of the more obvious critiques of the Declaration of the Rights of Man, the document from the French Revolution, I pointedly ignored what, from the standpoint of the crisis that has now been induced by climate change, may well be its most objectionable feature, namely the manner in which it terrifyingly assumes the dominion of man over nature. Right? It's a declaration of the rights of man and citizen. Where is nature there? Where is the Mother Earth? It is not only the West's Christian traditions, but even its much vaunted secularism, which have been parties to the severe diminishment and ransacking of nature. There may be a new twist to all this hubris if you call to mind the declaration of March 2017 by the High Court of Uttarakhand, a state, as I'm sure many of you know, in North India. This High Court made a decision in March 2017, a decision precipitated perhaps by a similar judicial ruling a few days earlier in New Zealand, where it declared that the rivers Ganga and the Yamuna and their tributaries have, quote, rights as a juristic, legal person and living entity, end quote. The Gandhi has not been recognized enough as the great ecological thinker that he was, even though there are many environmental movements that are greatly beholden to him, all the way from Chipko and the Narmada Bachao Andolan in India to conservation movements in Germany. I have explored that dimension at very substantial length in my published work and shall forego any discussion here. But the manner in which the Anthropocene age has come down upon us also suggests, fourthly, why we will certainly have to revisit our age's enchantment with rights and be more attentive to Gandhi's insistence on duties. We have made enough demands of nature. It's not merely something there to be exploited, mined, farmed, hollowed out. Nothing conveys better the duty we owe to nature now than this characteristically simple and yet moving anecdote from Gandhi's life, with which I shall conclude. So he had a close disciple and associate whose name is Kaka Kalelkar. And Kaka Kalelkar himself tells us that he was in the habit of breaking off an entire twig when he wanted merely 4 or 5 neem leaves that he needed to rub on the fibers of the carding bow to make its strings pliant and supple. When Gandhi saw Kaka Kalelkar doing that, he remarked, and I quote, "This is violence. We should pluck the required number of leaves after offering an apology to the tree for doing so. But you broke off the whole twig, which is wasteful and wrong." And I end with that. Thank you.